Hi folks, Florida Man here, with the final installment of my Basics of France series. Basics of France. Endgame. In the endgame, you're hopefully working toward your solo. Thus, this final video is a discussion of positioning to increase the possibility of that eventuality. After examining 50 games, where France soloed, I determined that in 100% of French solos, France controls the French home centers and Iberia. In 96% of French solos, France controls Belgium. However, in only 88% does France have Holland. In 90% of French solos, France controlled part of England, and in 80% France controlled all of England. Similarly, in 90% of French solos, France controls part of Germany, although France controls all of Germany in only 62% of French solos. This suggests to me both that Germany is a bit more naturally difficult for France to hold on to, and that a wiser French course in pursuing a solo is to go for England first, because the successful French players are more likely to have completely conquered England by the end than to have done so to Germany. I would note, though, that in 82% of games, France has part of Scandinavia. I would say that's almost definitive proof that in almost every game, if France wins, France has attacked both of its early neighbors before the end. France captures all of Scandinavia in 58% of French solos, which seems to show just how important it is to have forces in the north at some point in the latter part of the game, after England and Germany are hopefully weakened. France only captures St. Petersburg in about 40% of French solos, on the other hand, while it captures Tunis 74% of the time, which suggests to me that usually the French soloists focuses on the Mediterranean to some degree before going back for those Scandinavian and northern Russian centers. A winning France has part of Italy in 70% of games, and all of Italy in 42% of games, which is frankly more than I thought it would be, but shows that going after Italy is not nearly as necessary for France as going after Germany is, let alone England. France is more likely to control all of Scandinavia than all of Italy in a French solo situation, which shows the limitations of a Mediterranean strategy for France. France only controls part of Turkey in 18% of games, while France controlled part of Austria again in only 28% of games, and all of Austria in 10% of games. In almost all the games where France got part of Austria, France conquered part or all of Germany as well, which suggests that in the middle to late game, France is more likely going to be pushing east over land than by sea. Of course, most likely of all, France will have engaged in any combined land and sea invasion, because that makes it much easier to get the Italian centers and some of Austria than by just having fleets or armies. France only captures Warsaw in 14% of French solos, which is something I found remarkable when I reviewed these games. France got to Sevastopol exactly 0 times in the sampling of games I reviewed. If you're able to invade Germany, which France does a lot, one would think that invading Russia would be somewhat easy after that. But the truth is, Russia has a pretty good defense of all of the centers that are not St. Petersburg. The stalemate line spaces begin coming into play once you try to cross beyond Munich, which makes it more difficult than you would expect to get more Russian centers. Interestingly, a soloing France gets Greece 18% of the time, which is as often as France gets part of Turkey, and again, more often than France gets Warsaw. France is more likely to get Greece than Warsaw. That leads me into one of my major points about French endgame strategy, which I did not expect to be such a major point. Whether going north or south, France is a power that leans more heavily on its navy than most others, as compared with Germany, Austria, and Russia. It's impossible for France to capture and hold Scandinavia without significant numbers of fleets, and France is more likely to have the faraway center of Greece, or some Turkish centers, than it is to have Warsaw, which is clearly much closer to France on the map visually. So in order to have the muscle to pull off the solo win, it needs more of a balance between fleets and armies, rather than an overwhelming number of armies. France needs fleets to have the reach that it needs to win, and specifically it's likely to acquire its last few centers in Scandinavia, St. Pete, Germany, Italy, and possibly one center east of Italy. In most of the games I reviewed for this video, France ended up with 3 to 5 fleets in the Mediterranean, either expanding its holdings or protecting its gains in that region. France was slightly less likely to have fleets in the north than in the south in the Endgame, but France still frequently had Scandinavian centers, which I take to mean that France typically goes after Scandinavia earlier rather than later, and after capturing those northernmost centers, France doesn't need as many northern fleets anymore, and pulls those fleets south. Putting armies rather than fleets in Scandinavia, of course, is both more difficult for France and generally a less prudent use of resources, because armies are less flexible in that region where there are more sea spaces than land spaces. Key takeaways from reviewing the patterns I've observed. 1. France is a power that has to have more fleets than other powers, and probably at least around 6 or 7 by the endgame, most of which should probably end up in the Mediterranean, where there's going to be the most naval warfare in the late game, assuming you successfully killed England earlier. 2. France generally shouldn't bother trying to go after Russia in the late game. If France hasn't plowed through Germany early on and taken Warsaw by storm early on, it will usually be impossible to do so later. Instead, maybe take St. Petersburg and after that try to turn Russia into a janissary to help weaken Germany or the Eastern powers who might try to stop your solo. Russia is a natural French ally once you've established your dominance in the north, and assuming you can keep Russia from having armies in the north. 3. France doesn't need to go after any Italian center besides the normally Italian center of Tunis, but capturing any Italian center really helps, to the point that a successful French solo winner is almost as likely to have an Italian center or two as they are to have Tunis, which is almost a necessity for France to solo. If France doesn't have Tunis, France almost has to have Warsaw, which is, as we've seen, usually a difficult thing to do, since it's very defensible by Russia, and since it's easy to see France coming. 4. Most importantly, France needs to kill both of its western neighbors or cripple them in order to have any chance of soloing. They're the ones who have the best chance of attacking France directly, and in almost every game where France wins, France will have some centers from each of them. In 80% of games, France had all of the English centers, which in my experience usually means France and Germany took England out early, and then France backstabbed Germany. In a supermajority of games, France had all of the German home centers. For me, this means that France's path to victory ideally takes only a brief detour into the Mediterranean to get Tunis and maybe another dot or two, and then France focuses hard on making sure to capture the other centers that are part of the northern half of the north-south stalemate line, which means Germany, Scandinavia, and St. Petersburg. That's the reliable, tried-and-true path to the French solo. I hope you enjoyed the Basics of France series, and that you look forward to future content. If so, you should like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more exciting Florida Man productions. You can thank the people whose names now appear on screen for their support of this channel in the comments below. And until next time, Florida Man, out.